Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. Thank you very much for making time. We still have 1 or 2 minutes. Let's just wait a couple of minutes to allow other participants in, and then we'll be starting. Melissa, good to see your name here. Professor Rafat, also good to see your name here. Okay, I think we can start, and we'll continue admitting participants as they show up. Let me close this. Okay. Hi, Chong, good to see you. Okay, I'm very pleased to launch the research training program organized by the International Community Translation Research Group. And what a better way to start this program than by a presentation or webinar by Christopher Mellinger. I would like to thank Associate Professor Christopher Mellinger from the University of North Carolina at Charlotte for accepting our invitation. The webinar, as you know, is about survey-based research in community translation and interpreting. We will try to keep the program focused on community translation, but of course, different presentations might refer to interpreting as well. Chris is one of the best researchers who can talk to us about the subject of survey-based research, because he's an associate professor of Spanish interpreting and translation studies. He's also the co-editor of the journal Translation and Interpreting Studies, and I hope Chris will be able to share some insights related to publication as well, I mean, in terms of research methods. He's co-author of Quantitative Research Methods in Translation and Interpreting Studies, published by Routledge, co-editor of Translating Texts, an introductory coursework on translation and text formation, also published by Routledge, and editor of the Routledge Handbook of Interpreting and Cognition. Chris has also co-edited the special issues on community interpreting, translation, and technology for the journal Translation and Interpreting Studies, and also a special issue on translation process research that was for translation and interpreting, I mean, the journal Translation and Interpreting, which Ineke Krezi and myself edit. Thank you very much Chris, for accepting our invitation, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation, and it truly is a pleasure to be able to be with so many people from across the globe. So a good morning to some of you, good afternoon, and good evening to others. This presentation, and I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my slides here in a minute, is on survey-based research and focuses very much on methodology. And so I hope that you will find some of the ideas here to be useful in your research. And I'm also hoping that perhaps it will spark some conversations and some ideas as we continue on through the presentation. Just one quick note is if you have any questions or have any comments that you'd like to make and want to drop them in the chat, feel free to do so as the presentation is going on. I will do my best to try to watch for those and answer them if I can as we go, but otherwise we can always circle back to those on the back half of the presentation. This presentation really is going to kind of look at the who, what, where, when, and why of survey-based research, talk a bit about questionnaires, scales, measurement, how do we develop and write these, how can we adapt and adopt scales from different disciplines and bring them in to address community interpreting and translation, and also quickly touch on a couple of different psychometric properties that we might need to address in terms of validity and reliability. All of this really has a bearing on what it is that we do, the research that we do, how we go about publishing and disseminating our results. And so this doesn't really have it's not an argument of sorts that I'm putting forward today, except for the fact that perhaps it's a call to trying to integrate some best practices in relation to survey-based research methods. So it's going to be my attempt to add some sort of practicalities and tips throughout to help give people ideas with the type of work that we're doing as it goes, while also explaining some of the underlying concepts and ideas that are really driving that research forward. So I suppose I should start with a word of caution, in that we often think about, or there is a temptation that surveys are a fast and easy way to go ahead and collect a whole bunch of data. And so I would argue that's actually one of the myths of survey research. And so if we start to wade into the waters of doing survey-based research, we should be careful not to fall into the trap of thinking that surveys are fast and cheap, that'll just generate lots of data, that'll be super quick, that they're super easy to interpret, that they generalize quite easily, and that they're just completely unproblematic in terms of ethics. So these, I'm hoping, we can, over the course of the time that we have together, see how these might be a bit of a myth. Surveys are an incredibly powerful tool and something that can be really beneficial for those of us working in community translation and community interpreting spaces. But we need to be mindful that in order to get the types of research and the results that we'd like, that we need to be approaching them with a strong understanding of what is underlying a lot of these methods. So I think just to get started, it's helpful to look at some examples of perhaps less than ideal surveys. So I put two on the screen here. The one on the left is related to how safe you feel on a scale from 1 to 10, where both 1 and 2 are very unsafe, 3, 4, 5 are unsafe, 6, 7, 8 are safe, and 9, 10 are very safe. And so I'm not 100% sure that's a useful scale, but I offer it here as a point of departure to think about whether or not that would be something that we might want to revisit if we were trying to look at this particular survey item. Or on the right, what gender do you identify with? I present to you the 5 genders. Strongly disagree, somewhat disagree, neither agree or disagree, somewhat agree, or strongly agree. Clearly something has gone wrong with this survey item, but indeed, I'm not sure that we're measuring what we actually think we're measuring here. Also, I don't know about you, but I fill out lots of surveys. My university asks me quite often to fill out surveys. This is not for my university, by the way, but I get presented with tables on tables on tables with all sorts of rows, and you're supposed to click all of these boxes. And I don't know about you, but I get lost. And so this is perhaps a survey item that had the best of intentions, but instead becomes very difficult to try to answer. Think about what it might look like if it was on your phone in this increasingly digital space in which we're always trying to collect data. So perhaps this item might be revisited. And lastly, this is one that I found. There's actually a whole used to be Twitter, now X feed on bad survey questions. And so this came from, several of these came from there. But this one, if you have changed stores from a premium or a higher cost retailer to a value-based one, please list the retailers. And the response that came in was, I haven't changed stores. Your survey says if, why can't I just leave this blank? And so I think this gets at a number of challenges all in one related to surveys. And so hopefully over the course of this presentation, we can revisit and see if we can come up with some better ideas here. So why surveys? Surveys are incredibly powerful tools. And if we think about this from the perspective of community translation and interpreting, we can get at attitudes, behaviors, perceptions, values, perspectives, all of these latent underlying ideas that we can't directly observe. I cannot visually observe someone's values. I cannot visually take in or appreciate the attitudes they might have. We might be able to see other manifestations of those attitudes, but we can't actually see those themselves. So surveys are an opportunity or a way for us to be able to elicit information about any of these underlying cognitive characteristics of the people that we have completing our surveys, the respondents. And so that's an incredibly powerful set of questions and something that I think a lot of people in translation and interpreting are interested in. But they really allow us to answer questions about a specific population of interest. And in this particular case, we might think about the interpreters or translators themselves, or users and stakeholders of the services. Perhaps, if we're thinking about the legal setting, maybe it's the judges or the defendants or the litigants, or are they the hospital employees? Who are these people and why, and how might we be able to elicit information that helps us understand the various phenomena that we're interested in? When we say surveys are often is a very broad term. And in the methodological literature, surveys is actually a very broad term that encapsulates both interviews and questionnaires. For the purposes of this particular presentation, we're going to hang out more on the questionnaire side, on the side where we might see more numbers. I tend to hang out in the quantitative space, but that doesn't mean that we can't see them in both spaces. So just to give you a bit of a continuum here, surveys can run from a very qualitative type of methodology to something then that has a bit more structure with some open questions, some closed questions, or then even very much quantitative with numerical responses. So there's a large continuum here. When we talk about surveys, it's a very broad term. For the purposes of this, like I said, we'll probably hang out more on the questionnaire side, just so that we can get at some of the methodological considerations of that particular type of work. I think it's particularly important, though, as we get started in this space, to think a bit about how what we're trying to do relates to theory. We can have theory and we can have survey data, and they don't necessarily live apart from each other. We can have theory that is, or we can have surveys that are trying to build or test theories. But what's most important is that there is engagement between the two, that we either have data that we can then extrapolate from, and on the basis of that data, try to theorize about a specific phenomenon, or do we take those theories, do we then elicit data and see whether or not the questions that we're asking, does that theory hold up to scrutiny. So there is a relationship. It's a dialectic between these two areas, and it's incredibly important as we start positioning ourselves in some of this scholarship to think about whether or not we're taking a more deductive approach or an inductive approach. For folks that have ever either heard me talk about methods or have seen some of the work that I've done, it will probably perhaps be unsurprising to see here the importance of research ethics as it ties into all of this. And so there is a bit of an undercurrent to research ethics that we need to keep in mind when we're looking at survey research. And it's not something that happens just once. It's not just I checked the box, I passed my ethics review, but rather that the ethics need to permeate from research question all the way to publication. And so those research questions that we might be posing, how can we think about those questions from an ethical perspective, and then create a research design that is informed by those ethics, and then we can continue through the data collection and the analysis, and also the statistical design. There are ethics of quantitative analysis that often get they're not always explicitly discussed in the field, and so I think that's also an element that we as a community of researchers should be spending some time thinking about how we go about approaching the ethical analysis of the data that we collect. This is perhaps a bit of just a quick overview of some of these important questions in terms of research methods, but I think it's important we're on the same page as we get into some of the survey design elements. But really, I think it's important we keep in mind that a research question is a focused statement that is addressing a who, what, and why about the study. So we need to be thinking about that population of interest. Who are we talking about when we're conducting the study? Is it community translators in Australia? Is it interpreters focused that are working in Wallonia? Is it court interpreters who work in a southern district of Texas on the border? Or is it all interpreters and all translators? Who are we really interested in trying to talk about? How does that then relate to theories that we've seen? Again, this question of, is it an inductive or a deductive approach in which we're collecting survey data and trying to extrapolate, or are we trying to test theories that are in place in this new context or with this new population? And what are some of the major variables? And then also, what's our goal? Are we really trying to describe? Are we comparing groups? Are we exploring, explaining, looking at potential influences, evaluating? All of these questions can be addressed with surveys. Survey-based research can address many of the questions that are listed here. And it's really a question of framing and creating a structure, a research design that enables those questions to be addressed. So this is just a series of example research questions. And I'm sure that, given the range of names of people that I've seen logging in, there's going to be lots of different types of research questions that people might be interested in asking. And surveys can be either the primary data collection method for these sorts of questions, or they can be a way to augment or support or add an additional angle when looking at some of that scholarship. So this first question is one that is actually a topic that a colleague of mine and I have worked on, Tom Hansen and I did together, but looking at community interpreters. And do they differ with respect to their attitude toward technologies or their propensity to adopt technology? And so if we think about that previous slide, this is a comparison, and we're trying to look and see whether or not there are differences that come up between two different groups. How do deaf Americans and hard of hearing Americans differ in their attitude toward subtitles? Again, another opportunity for us to get at some of those underlying cognitive characteristics or perceptions that might not be readily apparent based on an observation alone. Community interpreters viewing their role in mediated communication. So again, we can try to understand the interpreters themselves. Professional status. This is an increasingly large or a growing anyway area of scholarship in the field, and whether or not professional status in and of itself, does that impact the way they go about doing their work? These are questions that the jury is out, so to speak. There's still more work to be done to understand these. But this provides a different sort of flavor of a research question, wherein we're able to then start taking specific theories of professional status and test them and see whether or not one element, this underlying cognitive behavior, might influence the practice of, or the execution of their work. Or how do people conceptualize translation and interpreting quality? Again, this is an effort to explain or to circumscribe or describe what it is that people who may or may not be actually doing the work itself, but who are instead using the services of language professionals to see whether or not sort of reception type studies. So this is just one swath, but I think it's useful to think about that, to see where there's so many different ways in which surveys can be used. And some of them are getting at more specific behaviors of individuals or groups of individuals, while others are trying to look at the practice or the process, while others are still looking at values. So how do we take this then and do this from a quantitative approach? So this slide here gives you something that's a bit more, it can feel anyway, somewhat qualitative. And I think qualitative work is incredibly important. And I think, I always try to make sure that I stress this. While my emphasis here is going to be largely on the quantitative side, the qualitative research is absolutely indispensable in the field. And we need to be able to pair some of that work together so that we get a fuller picture, a more holistic view of the phenomena that we're discussing. So how do we do this, though, from a quantitative perspective? Well, we can do this from a number of different ways. This slide is really just a reminder to all of us that when we are starting to talk about doing research from a quantitative perspective, we often are going to be situating that work within one of three different types of research designs. We can have an experimental, a quasi-experimental, or an observational research design. The definitions of these three are very much related to either random assignment into two different groups or two or more different groups, and whether or not there's experimental control. And so in the field of translation and interpreting, interpreting studies, there are very few truly experimental studies, because we cannot randomly assign a person that we pick up off the side of the road and say, you are now going to be in the group of translators. That's not something. There are underlying characteristics that define what it means to be a translator and interpreter. So it can be very difficult to actually get this random assignment. That doesn't mean that there's a problem with that, but it means that quite a bit of the studies that are experimental anyway are actually quasi-experimental, because there's a lot of experimental control, but there's not necessarily that randomization piece. And of course, we have observational studies, which I'm sure that many of us are familiar with. The reason this becomes important is because surveys figure into all three. You can have experimental surveys. You can have surveys that are actually designed to test and can randomly assign and can also control specific variables. If you think about A/B testing of different products, for instance, that's one way that might happen. We also can think about this. I think we can also just keep in mind that lots of methods can show up in any of these research designs. So interviews and questionnaires, we can have an experimental component. It can change across modalities. So it can be conducted online, in person, hybrid, you name it. And there's also a lot of thought that has to go into the structure and the order. So all of these things really can influence what it is that we're doing here. To go back to this idea of A/B testing, think about the last time you bought a car or a big purchase of some sort. There was a survey piece that was done not long ago, and it was looking at whether or not surveys could influence you to do something. And so it was experimental. And so people were randomly assigned to two different groups, Group A and Group B. And they filled out a survey about cars. That's basically what it was about. And there was one difference. In Group A, the survey that they filled out, It was all about cars, and it ended. Survey group B filled out the same exact survey, but at the very end, it added one extra question. And the question was, do you plan to buy a car in the next 6 months? It was the only difference. It's experimental design. We've randomly assigned people into the two different groups. The variable was controlled. It was just the addition of that one question. And they went back and they looked at these people 6 months later, and they figured out that by simply asking that one question, if they planned to buy a car, that they had a statistically significant difference, that they could influence people's behavior. And indeed, if you ask people if they're going to buy a car within 6 months, that group did, in fact, buy cars at a much higher rate than the other. So I think that story, while it's, I mean, you're welcome to go conduct that study with translators and interpreters if you'd like, but that story really, I think, helps recognize that what we're doing when we are conducting research can have an impact on what it is that our participants are doing, the way that respondents think and view things. And so all of this really becomes a big set of questions that we need to think through. So I'm not going to ask everybody to put down pros and cons of each of these modalities, but I would encourage you to think about what are some of the pros and cons if you are planning to conduct research. If you are going to do it by mail, the internet, on the phone, you're going to go out and do the survey in person, or you're going to bring people into the lab. So these are different ways that we can also end up influencing the studies that we're actually conducting. And modality also will have an impact on groups versus individual collection. So to start moving into some of this the quantitative side of this, I do think it's important that we think about what statistical design means. So in order for us to conduct a quantitative study, there's really 4 big questions. The first is sampling. We need to be thinking about who are the people that we want to study. What is the way in which we're going to pick those people? There's a question of power, which is something that sometimes people will talk about. It's really, how many people do you need in order for you to be able to make meaningful comments about what it is you're studying? So that's the first category. The second important element is descriptive statistics. So thinking about who your sample are. So how do we describe that group? What are the details about that group that we need to know in order to understand them? The types of tests that we're going to be doing. So are these parametric or non-parametric tests? These are quantitative analyses that fall within the realm of null hypothesis testing. And how important or meaningful those results will be. We can use effect sizes. And also questions related to limitations. So survey-based research can be incredibly powerful, but at the same time, we do run into some challenges. We run into some issues when people don't answer questions, when we might be influencing the outcome. And so these are all areas that we should be discussing. And in the next couple of sections, I'd really like to try to delve into the details of some of these. We won't be able to cover all of them. There's only so much time and there's so much work to be done in the area, but I would like to be able to touch on a couple of these pretty broadly. So sampling. The idea of sampling is when we're going to go and try to represent the group that we're interested in. So I asked the question earlier, are we interested in community interpreters that are working in one location, or is it in a specific context, or is it a group of people that are working in a specific area? But a good sample needs to be representative. So we really want to be able to represent that larger group and select a subset for us to be able to complete the work. So when we think about this from a quantitative perspective, we're thinking about numerical measurement and the ability to generalize. This is why quantitative methodologists spend so much time thinking about sampling, because if you're going to be putting a number on something and you want to try to generalize to the larger population, we need to make sure that when we collect the sample and we generate that sample, that we are going to be able to do it, and we are confident that it's going to be reflective of that larger group. When we're doing qualitative work, What's really important is really the context. And so a good sample there is making sure that we have enough representation that we can get a contextual understanding and that the results might be transferable to other settings in that way, but not necessarily generalizing to a larger population. So there's different goals. Both are quite important for us in the field to be doing. And I think we need to be doing more survey-based research in both areas. If you think about how much we know about community translation or interpreting in specific spaces, it's really, there are more questions than there are answers. But we really want to be making sure that when we generate that sample, that it's going to speak to the aims that we're trying for. So this is the visual representation. If you have the whole population, a sample is is a piece of it. Samples have statistics. So when we are going to for instance, we want to take the mean, we want to know the average height of people that in our sample. So the average height of all translators. That's a statistic. We can't actually round up every translator and measure their height. Theoretically, that population, translators, we do know that if we did line everybody up, we could find out what their average height is. And that would be the parameter. That's the population. So the goal of the sample is we generate a statistic and we're going to try to estimate the parameter. Descriptive tables help determine whether or not things are representative. So this is from a study by Timarova and Selets in 2011. And it's just demographic information, but it gives us a much better sense of the people that were involved in their study. So you can see that they had 3 different groups. They had conference interpreters, liaison interpreters, and a control group. So we can see how many of each one were included in the study. They had broken this down between male and female. They also had a general sense of the age and previous training and completing higher education degrees. So this gives us a much broader view of who they actually incorporated in their study. If we were to have conducted a survey with these people, we might want to be mindful that there were only 9 conference interpreters included in the study, when in fact there were 23 interpreters and 104 in the control group. So that's an important detail that we should watch for. And it gives us a fuller picture. This is a representation of why sampling matters. Error can creep into our studies. We can get what is called error when we're doing some of these statistical tests, and it can creep in everywhere. You can get it when we're looking at the population. We can get it when we're generating our sampling frame. We can get it because people self-select to either participate or they self-select to not participate. We can get error because people don't answer questions on our surveys. And all of those things we can try to control to a certain extent. And we can work on it with our research design and our procedures. And then there's this little bit at the end called statistical error. It's random and you can't get rid of that. So in order to try to get rid of some of the stuff at the top, we really spend time thinking about the approaches that we're going to do to try to generate those samples. So I asked this question before, but can a research population ever be all translators or all interpreters? Can we actually know for sure, make statements that say all translators like to translate literature? Like, is that what we want? Can we make those sorts of claims? I rounded up 50 translators and they all said that they like to translate literature. Therefore, all translators across the world like to translate literature. I think the answer is pretty obvious. We can't always speak to the group of all translators or all interpreters. Can we, and the same thing happens, can we speak about all fiction readers or all deaf television viewers? So it becomes important that we're circumscribing the work that we're doing, and we're trying to instead create a sample that will speak to a population that we think is a plausible population. So we can get some error in terms of coverage if we have a mismatch between the population, so that the group that we decide that we think we're talking about and the sample themselves. So that population of interest versus who we actually get. And we're trying, to the extent that it's possible, to generate a sample that really will speak to that population of interest. So one way that we can do that is we can depending on the types of studies that we're looking at, we can try to get that demographic information and see if we can sort people into certain groups to see whether or not they truly are responding to the questions that we're asking. Unfortunately, the reality is many times with our studies, we have to rely on whoever answers. We put that survey out there and we say, hey, please take my survey. And we run into the challenge of, if people choose to take it, well, they might be motivated. They might have an agenda. I'm going to go fill out that survey because I want people to know that my perspective on technology is X. And they tend to have a tendency toward extreme opinions. There's a group in the middle that perhaps might not care too much about that particular topic. So we also have to keep in mind that the surveys that we're doing might be eliciting folks on one end of the, one extreme or the other. There can be that tendency, increases our variance. Unfortunately, we also can't, we have to be careful that sometimes people don't answer pieces. And why they choose to do that is something that is worth reflecting on. Why did that person choose not to answer that question? Is it because they didn't want the researcher to know what they actually thought? Maybe they're embarrassed by it. Maybe they don't want to answer it because it really isn't pertinent to them. Maybe they say, I'm tired of this survey. I've been working on it for a while and I'm just not interested anymore. So we've got a lot of different principles, there are challenges that are associated when people don't answer. And sometimes it's related to who we've actually asked the questions to. It's always a good idea when you're doing a study, or if you're writing up a study, publishing it in a venue, to report the non-response rate. It's important. It gives us insight into whether or not there might have been a challenge or a problem that was kind of going on. So again, I promise I won't put lots of equations on the screen, but here's some statistics that are coming here. Our goal is to estimate the population's parameter. There is a theoretical average height of all translators in the world. Instead, we're going to find a sample of them, we're going to measure, and then we're going to try to make an inference about what we think that is. So based on that sample, can we somehow extrapolate and guess what that is? Average height is a silly thing. Let's think about, there is a true average wage of a community interpreter. We could find that out, but we can't necessarily do that economically or feasibly. So instead we get a sample and then we try to infer what that might be on the basis of a couple of details. That's what's happening here. Randomization becomes important because it allows us to make stronger claims about generalization. So when I say randomization, what I mean is it's a way for us to randomly select people to participate in our study. And we don't often do that. We often are asking just whoever will do it. So that's a different thing. But randomization, if you think about, for instance, I'll use an Australian example, the NAATI, the National Organization of Translators and Interpreters. They have a roster. And so we could, if we had access to that roster, we could randomly generate, we want 45 people, or we want 125 people to be randomly selected from that. That gives us a much better sense of being able to say, this might generalize to that larger population, but it requires us to have that frame to be able to say that that group is who we're talking about here. I mentioned that there's always random error in our studies, and it's inherent in measurement. You can't get away from it, but our goal is to try to minimize that. So if we're going to ask those 125 people that we picked from the roster, we want, to the extent that it's possible, to ensure that our measurements are going to be consistent, and they're consistent in terms of they're measuring what we want them to measure, and that we're not going to get some of that error creeping in. And lastly, we can control some of this through our design. And so if we're asking them to do something, for instance, we might create experimental conditions that allow us to suggest that something causes something else. We have to be really careful because you don't want to end up with extra variables that are floating around that could somehow confound the study. But when we're looking at surveys, that design piece becomes incredibly important. So to move into a little bit, just to summarize this a bit more, the idea, so randomization is when you take like a random generator number or random number generator and you pick a bunch of people at random. So everybody has an equal probability of being included. That's what we call simple random sampling. But we can also have stratified sampling. So we can divide the population into different groups. So if we look at the roster, the professional translator interpreter roster, we could say, I'd really like to have a random number of people. I'd like to have 50 people randomly selected from people at each different type of certification. Or I want 50 people randomly selected that have 1 to 5, 6 to 10, 11 to 15, 16 to 20 years of experience. So that's a stratified approach. It helps us if we think that years of experience might be a variable of interest to us, we can stratify, and then we can do that random selection from within the groups. We can also do systematic, and I did see a paper, there's at least one that I have seen that was done on interpreting where they were able to take a roster or a group of people and they started and they picked every 18th person. And so that was a selection that they did to try to sample. So it meant that they were able to try to get a broader view. So there are a lot of different ways to do this. And I think that this is really important that we don't talk about this all the time because sometimes it's really a matter of convenience for us to be able to collect survey data. But these are ways that we can also approach it. And so I'd like to just put these forward as a potential opportunity for reflection and to see whether or not it might be useful in your work to consider the possibility of some of these sampling methods. These are some of the ones that we see often. We see convenience, saves time, saves money, but we might not actually get a well-defined population. Snowball sampling is another one that's kind of related, where we're trying to reach certain groups. And so we say, dear federal interpreter, you happen to have a network of people. Why don't you send it out to your friends? And so we can get into that network of people. It then becomes a matter of convenience, whether or not people do it. But it does rely on some of those networks. We can also have purposive sampling and we can have heterogeneity sampling, which are other ways for us to try to reach different people. But when we are talking about this from a quantitative perspective, some of these make it harder for us to make the case that what we're actually measuring is going to generalize to a larger population. So to bring all of this and put a bow on it and move on to a different area of topic or area of discussion, I think it's really important that we spend time defining our population. Who are we surveying? And what are the characteristics of those people? And can we find ways to either avoid non-response or we can randomly select people? And if we're going to use more of a convenience or snowball sampling approach, can we recruit broadly? Can we try to avoid different simply based on convenient because they were there? And consider the implications of what we might call weird samples. I don't know if you've seen the acronym WEIRD. It doesn't mean strange, but it's Western, educated, rich groups. And so that each one of those letters correspond to a group. And we tend to see surveys are often completed by this kind of group. So the running joke in psychology is the most studied group of people, bar none, on the planet are first and second year psychology students at the university. Why? because they have to participate in surveys and in experiments so that they can get credit for their courses. So many studies have all been conducted on first and second year psychology students. We know a lot about them. And yet people are always trying to generalize to a larger population related to them. So when we're looking at reporting, we should be obviously describing whatever sampling procedure we use, the descriptive statistics that are being used, and report and acknowledge any of the shortcomings that we might run into. Once we've decided who these people are going to be, we actually have to do something with them. And so Likert scales tend to be the primary, or one of the primary ways that people try to conduct surveys. And if anything, this is my call to action, that we recognize that Likert scales are, first off, they're called Likert scales. Dr. Likert is the man who did it. It's not Likert, it's Likert. And he had a very specific idea of what a scale is. First of all, it is a series of items that are all summed together for a final score. So it is not simply a collection of items that are then analyzed individually. The idea was that there would be a series of items. Each one of those items they would respond to with a verbal anchor. They tend to be statements that you agree or disagree with. And all of these are trying to get at one underlying unitary construct. And there is at least one item that's been reverse coded. So this is a very specific type of scale. It's a very specific type of survey that is trying to get at an underlying psychological construct. And so if there's an example there of 3 of them on the screen, so it's a statement, it's not a question, but Wikipedia has a friendly user interface. It's either strongly disagree, strongly agree, and then there are anchor points in the middle, right? And the idea would be is that all of those items could then be summed together and we could come up with a number. And that number could then be used for subsequent analysis, but they're all trying to point at a single underlying construct. If it doesn't meet those rather stringent requirements, then we might call it a Likert type scale. So it's similar, but that would be ones that have questions as opposed to statements, or they have different numbers of responses. In this instance, we're looking at, there's an odd number, there is a midpoint there, and it was developed with 5, but we can see it with 4, 5, 6, whatever. There can also be options for non-response, and then we can also use different scales than agree and disagree. So this is a terminological distinction, but it's one that really reflects the method that's actually being used, whether or not we're trying to describe something that is a unitary underlying psychological construct, or whether or not it's something else. The way we can also think about this is from the perspective of if it's reflective or formative. And so a reflective scale, that there's an underlying factor, and I'm not going to dwell on this for too long, but there's an underlying factor that causes a bunch of things that we can then observe. A formative one, however, is when we try to say there's a bunch of different things that when we add all those up together, that describes a construct. That's a lot of words, and I think it's much easier to visualize it. So it looks like this. A reflective scale, we have an underlying construct that affects the responses of items. So that whatever that underlying variable is, it's going to manifest in different sorts of ways. Whereas a formative one, where we have multiple things that all add up. So to give you an example, socioeconomic status. So remember, reflective, there's one thing that's underlying that is going to manifest in different ways. So what do reflective items look like? I like to shop on the weekends. There's an underlying variable, socioeconomic status, that is going to manifest by whether or not people agree or disagree with that statement. So for instance, if we have somebody who likes to shop on weekends, or they like to go out to dinner with their friends, or they like to prioritize specific things, that might suggest that they are going to be on one end of that scale versus on the other. Formative scale would be a little different. A formative scale is where we have multiple things we say, well, it's really important. The income percentile, educational attainment, and neighborhood are all things that might, if taken together, be indicative of a socioeconomic status. So these are two fundamentally different ways of viewing surveys, and when we're creating items, we have to be mindful of which one we're trying to create. So what does this look like on the ground? When we're actually doing survey research, we're trying to find focused items that are not double-barreled, so that they're answering on a specific topic or a specific element. They're not answering an either or, it's one thing. They're using familiar language, they're using familiar syntax, they're not having to work at it too hard to understand the item that's been presented to them. We're avoiding ambiguity and complex language. We're using specific and concrete language. It's the idea is that we can write an item that would be readily understandable and can then be interpreted by the person who's responding. And we're going to try to avoid leading questions and statements. We're not going to try to bias them into responding in one direction or the other. And lastly, in thinking about the potential to translate some of these things, avoiding single and double negation. In English, we can say, we can have two negatives, which then make a positive, but once something goes negative in Spanish, it's always negative in Spanish. And so we want to try to avoid some of those challenges when we're working. Same thing with structure. I think it's important we keep that in mind. If we're going to be doing demographic information, you want to have exhaustive and mutually exclusive response options. We don't want people to accidentally be answering one way when they could have answered another way. We're trying to create, we want to be able to see clear divisions between the different items that are in play. Providing a frame of reference can be really helpful. So having the scale anchored labels is really helpful. And if you're not 100% sure, like on a scale from 1 to 10, well, what does that mean? What is 1? What is 10? How do they interpret the intensity or the severity on either end of those anchors? Having an option for people to say no opinion, I don't know, or a midpoint is quite useful. There are some people that have very specific reasons for wanting to not have a midpoint. They want to force them to choose one side or the other. And if you're going to do that, you need to justify it. You have to be able to show and explain why. A lot of times there are very conscious decisions that researchers make, and we just don't know why people have done it because they never wrote it down. And so one way to try to avoid some of the challenges, I think, when writing these sorts of things up is, one, think about them ahead of time, but then two, if there was a conscious decision that was made, making sure that that's clear for people can really help your readers understand the choices that you've made throughout the process. So once you've sort of started to create the scale and create some of these ideas, we can certainly pre-test and pilot test surveys, and it's very good practice to be able to do that. The reason we do that is partly in relation to what we were just talking about briefly with comprehension, making sure that the items are actually being understood, that then the person can remember what the question was that has been asked, they can make a judgment and then respond accordingly. We want to be able to make sure that we're truly measuring what it is rather than accidentally getting something that is not exactly what it is that they're trying for. There is a slight difference between pilot testing and pre-testing. The difference is here on the screen, but both of these can be incredibly useful. Pre-testing, it's usually a small sample, often has an expert review, somebody looking at it, getting feedback about your items and your questions. This is often used in qualitative studies, and we're trying to get a general sense of that instrument. Whereas pilot testing is we can try to sample, and they go through the whole procedure, including the way in which the survey is going to be administered. And we can get some open-ended feedback on it as well, but it's really running it through its paces and making sure that the instrument is able to function in the way that we want it to function. Sometimes we hear people talk about holdout samples. for pilot testing as well. But really, there is a bit of a difference that we see between these two. When we're looking at testing on the qualitative side, we see a lot of reviewing for, did this work? Did it work the way that we thought it was going to work? Did it violate our expectations? But we're trying to get a sense of what it is that actually happened. Whereas on the quantitative side, there are a lot of actual powerful math that can happen with these instruments. So there can be factor analysis. We can do reliability statistics. We can try to evaluate the psychometric properties of the scale. Our goal when we're doing this sort of quantitative work is to ensure that the measurement, so when we're actually assigning numerical values to some of what we're looking at, is replicable, and that it's going to be meaningful for us. So there's slight differences in how we might go about approaching the topic. So thinking about this from a practical perspective with pre-testing and with creating your items, after you've done some of this work, are there items that are performing inconsistently, that they're just not working the way that you thought that they were going to work? Sometimes this happens due to polysemia. Sometimes it happens because people misread things. Sometimes it happens because people misunderstand an item. And so trying to avoid misunderstood questions. Also evaluating the length of the survey. I'm sure everyone has taken a survey and abandoned it at least once in your life. And I don't know what that threshold was for you, but maybe it's like, ugh, I've been answering this survey for 15 to 20 minutes. I'm just done. I don't want to do it anymore. Or this is really interesting. I can keep going for 30 minutes, right? The length of the survey can also have a bearing. And so figuring out which elements are truly necessary to answer the questions that you want to ask, and can you elicit enough data to be able to answer it without it becoming something that's overly burdensome. The order is also super important. Sometimes people will put the demographic information up front. Sometimes they put it at the very end. There's risks of both. If you put it up front, you might get beautiful descriptive statistics, but then people get tired and they don't answer the rest of it. Or on the flip side, you put it at the end and they fill out all of the scales that you want them to answer, but then you know nothing about your people. So figuring out that order and the length and balancing that can be really important. And also the question of mandatory responses. Some people just don't want to answer certain questions. And if you make everything mandatory, sometimes people will simply give up rather than trying to come up with an answer. They might not want to lie about their answer, but they certainly also have decided that they don't want to answer anymore. So weighing the pros and cons of those mandatory answers will be important for you. So if you decide you want to go down the route of developing a scale, there are at least 7 steps. I promise you I will not put the math on the screen. But I do want to remind you that this is going to be hanging out on the right-hand side of the screen here. This is the numerical scores when we're really trying to look at numbers and create a scale that is going to be replicable and is going to be usable. So if we're going to do it, we're going to do it right. We need to decide what the construct is that we're going to measure. So we need to come up with some sort of theoretical reason or item or topic or concept that we want to measure. And so there are not a ton of these that are out there. There's one that's called IPRI, which is that Claudia Angelelli did in 2004, that is looking at perceptions of visibility and things like that in relation to interpreters. But there's a theory that's driving it. There's a reason for trying to do that. And we're trying to examine that in relation to other constructs. We are trying to ensure that we know the population that's of interest, and we really circumscribe it quite well. We then generate a bunch of items. We try to come up with a bunch of items that it might work, that might reflect, they might show or manifest some of the that underlying concept that we can see. We try to follow all those good practices of not having double-barreled questions and not double negation and all of those sorts of things. And we try to align these items so that we think that they'll line up correctly with the concepts that we're trying to understand. We have them reviewed. We have some folks take a look at them, making sure that we've fully and completely understood the construct, that we weigh whether or not each item that's being asked is actually going to fit into the study, and that it is appropriate for that particular study. That the items are clear, that we haven't missed anything, really trying to make sure that we've double checked everything. All the T's are crossed, all the I's are dotted. We then do a true pilot test. In an ideal world, you have lots of people do this. In translation and interpreting, that's hard because there's only so many translators and interpreters. And we also want to be able to use them in our studies as opposed to just having them pilot test everything. But we do need to be coming up with a sample that's representative. So those questions that we had about sampling become really important here. And were we successful at a randomized sample? Were we successful at creating a group of people that are representative of a larger population? Making sure that pilot sample is actually lining up with our population. We then can evaluate their responses. There's something called EFA, of exploratory factor analysis. It allows us to look at some descriptive statistics, the dimension. So did we actually see an underlying unitary construct? Are there multiples? Are there multiple factors? And how reliable are they? Are we able to get an appropriate, consistent type of response based on the type of people that we have? Then we revise. So we can revise based on the information that we see. If we have the factors loaded correctly, if we see that there's an item that doesn't make any sense, maybe it gets thrown out. Or it gets revised or tweaked, we see that maybe we have something that's emerging that we're not 100% sure, we might add another item or two. So it's a very iterative process that we're going through to really make sure that the measurement, that the instrument itself is allowing us to measure what we want it to measure. And then once it's done, actually conducting the survey, deploying the questionnaire, we can then do confirmatory factor analysis to make sure that those underlying results hold up, that the factors that we thought we saw earlier on actually are coming out, and we can certainly replicate that across different areas. This is a very common thing in communication studies, and if this is foreign to you, or if this is something that you might be interested in, I'd encourage you to take a look at communication studies, because there's a lot of really interesting research that's been done in that space. They have whole volumes of scales that have been developed. Psychology has a number of them too. Translation and interpreting, we have borrowed some. There are folks that have done that, where we've borrowed and adapted. But there's a large tradition of survey-based research that we can draw on and we can benefit from. And so finding ways to leverage and appropriately cite and bring scholarship into the discipline can be quite useful. And it's that adoption and adaptation that I think that we certainly would benefit from. There's a lot of benefits from that. One of it is all those steps, it's already been done. And so we're able to, we already know that some of the instruments work very well. And we can then plug into a community of research, a community of scholarship that's already working with some of these constructs. It can be a little bit faster. It can be a little bit easier to do that. By the same token, there is some drawbacks. You have less control and you might not have as much novelty. I'll give you an example. When Tom Hansen and I were working on our paper in 2018 related to technology and the propensity to adopt, we were really interested in how people interacted with technology. And so what we did was we found a scale that we liked, but we then adapted it for interpreters. So it wasn't, it was quite nice in the sense that we knew that this instrument worked well, but it did mean that we were kind of constrained by the instrument, the way it originally designed, because if we had changed too much, we might end up breaking that underlying factor structure, and we would have to then basically go back and start from the beginning. So there are certainly benefits and there are drawbacks, and you have to kind of weigh the pros and cons. The adaptation piece is quite handy. And so you can adapt it to a new situation. So in our case, we took a scale that was related to technology more generally, and then we applied it to interpreters. We can also adapt through translation. There's a whole special issue in the journal Translation and Interpreting that is related to survey translation. There's also a recent, well, relatively recent book out on the sociolinguistics of survey translation. There's a lot to be said for thinking about translation, the translation of survey instruments. Tom and I have been working a bit on looking at what happens to the psychometric properties when we do that kind of translation work through simulation. And so hopefully that'll be something that we can share soon. And then we can obviously adapt from another discipline. But this is a way for us to make methodological contributions in translation and interpreting that we haven't been able to do. We've borrowed concepts, we've borrowed questions, we've borrowed methods, but sometimes these instruments aren't always thought about. And so it is another opportunity for us to reflect on that. It also gives us the opportunity as experts in translation and interpreting to contribute back out to other disciplines as well. So there's a bit of a dialectic there. The question of psychometric properties, I think, is and this is going to be kind of the final topic that I mentioned today. We'll talk through it here for a little bit. Is related to validity and reliability. These are words and terms that get thrown around a lot in community translation and interpreting research, and any type of TNI research, frankly. And they're sticky. Validity is a general concept. And the main idea is, are we measuring what we say we're measuring? And so the concept of validity, this is a book that is a bit older. And folks in psychometrics have been spending a lot of time thinking about this. And so Boersboom, has a fantastic book. It's on measuring the mind, very dense, but I fully recommend it if you're ever interested. And he says that a scale, so a survey instrument, is valid if and only if it measures an underlying attribute that causes observable variation in the measurement outcome. So that's a very psychometric approach. This has then since been moved along, and so our definition of validity is that it's a holistic evaluation, that the scale is appropriate, useful, and meaningful. We're getting at the same ideas here, but validity is a concept that requires reflection. And it's something that if you're going to do survey-based research, you have to be able to talk about the validity and the reliability of a measure or of an instrument. So you might see there's lots of different types of content validity that are out there, or types of validity that are out there, content validity being but one. But content validity is basically a survey scale needs to measure all the aspects. So for example, if you're going to do something on life satisfaction, you have to consider a combination of health, home, work, and relationships. So that's sort of a content validity. It's related to the content that's there. Face validity is a sort of a subtype where we're asking if these are all kind of related. So at face value, does that fit? Now, I'm going to give you an example. In World War I, well, around the time of World War I, there were actually a number of efforts to do intelligence tests. So the question that would get asked as part of that question was, in what city do the Dodgers play baseball? Does anybody know what city the Dodgers play baseball? You can type it in the chat. The Dodgers now play in Los Angeles. It's their baseball team. But at the time, they played in Brooklyn, which, yes, interpreter two. It is true. They currently are in LA. Previously, they were in Brooklyn. And yet, if you were a recent immigrant to the United States, would you know that? And why would you care? And so one of the issues that came up is that this question was actually geared toward a certain group of people. It was not actually related to the design of the survey, or of the, it didn't point to the right population. And this is an example. It's not mine. It comes from a book by Stephen Gould called Mismeasure of Man. It's really quite interesting. But face validity really is related to a respondent understanding. And really, do we think that knowing where the Dodgers play baseball is really related to intelligence? That's another question. If we think so, that these are two types of validity. We also have something called construct validity. So a survey scale in construct validity basically means, does it align with some sort of theoretical framework? So Angelelli has a theory of interpreter invisibility. It's 5 subcomponents. They're on the screen. And that's how she conceptualizes that construct in 2004. And it's been used by other people, and it's been kind of modified. But that's what construct validity is looking at. Related to construct validity are the 3 others that are on the screen here. If we try to measure this similar constructs, if there were a similar construct, does that actually get similar measurements? And can we also discriminate between or distinguish between other traits? And does it actually align with previous literature? And so these are big questions of validity that we see that pop up as well. We also get criterion validity. They need to be related to other things. So I'll give you another example. So if there are multiple scales of introversion, do they actually line up with each other? That's the question. Concurrent validity basically says, if I measure something with my scale, do I get similar types of results to other scales that supposedly are trying to measure the same thing? Predictive validity is a little different. It's trying to, can we use a survey to potentially predict something about another variable? So do SAT scores, so do standardized testing scores, do they somehow predict your college GPA? Maybe. There was a great move away from standardized test scores about 10, 15 years ago. And now there's some universities that are moving back to them and saying, well, maybe they did do something. Maybe they did measure something. We're not 100% sure. And so there's been a lot of back and forth on whether or not the validity of the instruments that are being used, do they actually do that? So it's always a moving target. There's a lot of questions that are coming up here. The reason that I put all of these validity things on here, and you don't have to memorize all of them, is that you can't necessarily establish whether or not an instrument is valid quantitatively. And you can't say, well, it's like sort of valid, sort of not. Like, you have to come up with a holistic view based on all of these things to be able to make the argument that an instrument or a measurement is valid. And so you can do that through either looking at the content of the items itself, the way that the process was done, the structure of the survey, its relationship to other variables, the consequences of testing. There's all of these different things, but at the end of the day, it's a holistic argument that you have to make to be able to say that the survey instrument is somehow a valid instrument. Now, I just finished harping on validity, and now all of a sudden I'm saying that there are other notions. There's actually a lot of thought and a lot of thinking and writing that's going on right now that's trying to get away from thinking about validity in all of these different forms: face, content, construct, convergent, divergent, nomenological. Like, they're trying to move away from that. And so Messick is trying to argue that validity is all under one umbrella of construct. Borsboom argues that there's 2 parts of it. One is the construct itself. One is related to the actual observable variation. It's a larger theoretical debate. But what I think is really important is that we recognize that that methods and methodology research is continuing to develop. I was having a conversation earlier today, actually, with somebody about quantitative research methods. which probably doesn't surprise some of you if you know me. But the point came up because there was a question about whether or not there was a need to try to revisit quantitative research methods. And they said, well, has really anything happened in the last 10 years that warrants revising or revisiting some of the things that you might have said in the past about quant methods? And at first I thought, I've sort of taken aback. And then I also realized this is actually kind of reminiscent of a larger challenge that we sometimes have. We get so focused on some of the work that we're doing, and we see all of the developments that are happening, that the tools that we're using, what we feel like are most stable for us, there are points of departure. The idea that those are somehow moving along with us can be kind of destabilizing. And much in the same way that the statistics that your parents or your grandparents might have learned whenever they were taking methods courses or they were in school, those have now changed. We now have a better understanding. There's been research that's been developed. Statistics is a field unto itself where there's research and scholarship that's happening. And so it's important for us to realize that when we borrow something into the field or when we rely on some of these tools, that they are also a subject of reflection unto themselves. And so research methods, while incredibly useful and powerful, and they allow us to do a lot of things, they also merit considerable reflection as well. And so I think it's important that we are mindful that the concepts and constructs that we're using here, validity, reliability, these sort of strong tenets that we all often point to, they're also in flux. And so being able to revisit and reimagine and participate in things like this, where maybe you don't want to go read through all that, but there are folks that are interested in some of these methods might be able to bring a new nugget or a new piece that to the puzzle. So I think it's an important reminder that we just constantly reflect on what it is that we're doing and how we go about doing it, because the understanding of this will change as time goes on. Reliability is one of the last pieces here that I'll touch on here. And so while validity was trying to get at are we measuring what we actually think we're measuring, reliability is the idea that if we use this tool, can we get similar results again? So measurement is we always have some random error. That's going to happen naturally. But strong reliability gives us a better sense of that we're getting consistent results when we're measuring the same person. So we can measure the same person multiple times. That's called test retest reliability, where you repeat the measure, you should get about the same result. If for instance, I measured the height of if I measured the height of a translator, and the first time I get 1.4 meters, and the second time I measure them, I get 2.7 meters. Either we need to go find out what happened to that person, or maybe that's not a very good tool. So the sample, we should be able to see that the measurement is the tool is giving us similar measures. We can do that through a number of different measures. There are quantitative measures to do this. Pearson's R, Kendall's tau. These are two that we often will see. And the idea that if we measure somebody, a group of people, and we measure them again, we should get something that's kind of similar. We also do get some internal reliability. This is related to surveys very explicitly, where we see the structure, the internal reliability of the instrument, that multiple items are measuring the same construct. They should be getting similar types of scores. We should get some sort of consistency that's there. And we should see some correlations between those two. So this is just an example of extroversion. So if we have somebody who that is scoring high on extroversion, then we should see items that they are scoring similarly when they talk about being talkative, full of energy, being outgoing and sociable, and they should have the opposite when they mark tends to be quiet. If they were all marking the same thing for all four of them, then there's a reliability issue because number 4 is flipped, right? It's backwards. Oops, wrong way. There's also the most common measure is Cronbach's alpha. This is not an attempt to try to hawk this book, but it is certainly a reference that I would encourage people to take a look at, because we've done a lot of the reading through some of these tests, so you don't have to. But this is the math that's associated to Cronbach's alpha, and it is a measure of internal reliability, and we can then use so not only in 1979 gave sort of these categories for whether or not something is sufficiently reliable, and we're shooting for a score that's somewhere between 0.7 and 0.9 most of the time. You can have something that's too reliable too, that all of a sudden it seems like you're not getting enough variation. So to kind of put an image to it, we sometimes see it with a bullseye, but validity is about accuracy and reliability is about precision. So being able to measure what we think we're measuring and also do it consistently on a regular basis. So I've been going for about an hour and 20, and I'm going to throw you a life ring and say, oh my gosh, do we still want to do surveys? And I'm just going to put a few quick key takeaways on the screen, and then I'd be happy to talk about any questions or ideas or anything that has occurred to you over the course of time. But really, all this kind of boils down to the decisions about the research design, decisions about survey-based research methods will impact the way that you analyze your data. And so the decisions that you make up front are going to impact what you can do later on. The analysis is also driven by the theoretical considerations up front. These are completely linked together. There's no way to decouple them. And as a result of that, you can't undo the mistakes at the beginning. So if for whatever reason you run your survey and you realize it would have been really nice if you had had that one extra question, or that you have something that's phrased in a way that you're getting something wild and crazy, you can't go undo it. The only thing you can do really is throw it out. And so it's really important to be thinking about the process of developing it, from sampling through pilot and pre-testing through the analysis stage, that these are all very closely linked, and planning through survey-based research is really key. We have to be thinking and mindful. So to go back to some of those myths, yes, we can certainly collect data in a sometimes more cost-effective manner, and it can feel very quick, but there's a lot of lead time and a lot of work that goes into it up front to ensure that it's a meaningful result that we get on the backside. And so with that, I'm going to say thank you very much. I do have a bunch of these references are here. They're available. If you'd like to be able to see some of these, I'd be happy to share them with you. But with that, I will say thank you very much. And do you have any questions that you'd like to talk about?
Thank you very much, Chris. I enjoyed the presentation and learned a lot. Yeah, we're happy to take questions.
And if you're overwhelmed, that's okay too. I've been talking at you for a little bit.
While waiting for questions, here's one, maybe. Okay, thank you, Vanessa. Yeah, while waiting for questions from participants, I have a few.
Sure.
One of the things you mentioned is that it is likely that the questions of a questionnaire or a survey itself can influence the participants or potential participants. Does that raise any ethical issues?
Yes and no. So I think we have to be mindful of that. I do think that it is possible to influence people, because if you think about a survey, they might not have sat down to really think through some of these questions. So yes, it's possible to influence it. I think we're all human beings, and it's natural to then all of a sudden be drawn to that. A lot of times when people fill out ethics review requirements, They have to talk about the potential benefits or drawbacks or the impact that a study might have on them. And this is one area where we might spend time thinking. I would like to think that there's not a lot of concern if we're asking people about their work. That hopefully that doesn't create an ethical conundrum. But by the same token, if we ask them questions about sensitive topics or about specific examples, it might then have something bubble up that could influence their practice. And so there are certainly instances in which the types of questions that we're asking certainly require some additional ethical reflection.
Thank you. We have a question from Clara.
Sure. Oh.
I can't.
Oh, there you are.
Oh, okay, okay, great. Thanks so much. Chris, hi.
Hi.
It was a very rich talk. I'm still digesting, but there are many questions, but I'm curious about sampling. One of the sampling methods you introduced was snowball sampling. Yeah, and that's what I used, and also to declare a survey and a quantitative approach are not my best suits. So this is very useful. So can you talk more about the rigor of snowball sampling? Also because sometimes that's perhaps the most convenient or the feasible approach we could use, and especially, for example, in my ongoing project, if I'm going to survey the ethnic minorities in Hong Kong, I was thinking, so that was what I used. And the other related issue that I wanted to ask you is about the size of the participants and the response rate.
Sure.
So and coupled with that, you were mentioning about to run a test, but there are very limited populations of the participants. Sometimes we probably feel refrain from risking using them already. Yeah, maybe that's those questions for those questions first. Thanks so much.
Yeah, so I think you're asking all the right questions. So I think you're talking about your project about a specific population or a group, and so that's obviously getting access to some of these populations is hard. I mean, that's just the nature of some of this work. And so I think about there's a relatively recent paper by Maria Lomenia Galliano that's on hidden populations, and it's in FITISPOS, I think, in 2020 maybe. But it reflects on some of the questions that you're asking. How do I get access to these groups? How do I go about doing it? How do I do it in a way that's not exploiting or exploitative? And surveys are one way to do that. And it's also so those types of questions they're big questions that you have to kind of wrestle with from an ethics perspective. At the same time, from a methods perspective, which is tangled up in all of this, is surveys are, we can have an ideal of what we think is perfect. I can create this perfect sampling frame. It's going to be randomized and it's going to be perfect and it's going to be amazing. And then it doesn't actually work because we can't actually use it with that particular group. And so in order for you to access that particular group or to be able to collect the type of data that you need, maybe snowball sampling or convenience sampling is really the best way for you to go. So I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with using it. I think we then just have to be mindful that the population we're trying to look at is actually one very specific group. And maybe we're not trying to generalize to all people. We're trying to instead describe that particular group in it and understand it from a contextual perspective. And so maybe a more qualitative approach is going to be what's really useful for you. Sure, descriptive statistics can be helpful. We can know more about them, about the group that we're talking about, but maybe we're not trying to extrapolate to all people across everything. So I think a qualitative approach is really a great way to do that. It's kind of related to your question on response rates too, because I don't know how big the group or how big the population is that you're interested in. But if we're talking about, I don't know, this is me just kind of thinking through numbers out loud with you. But if you say, well, I have 10 people, well, is 10 people really going to say much about a group of 1 million? But if you say, well, there's about, I don't know, there's a population of 20,000 people of this group that I'm interested in, and I got responses from 200, that's very different. So I think it's a relative type of thing, and there's no clear-cut perfect way to make that sort of determination. And so I think you have to kind of weigh the pros and the cons. What I always suggest for in these sorts of instances is being just very upfront and honest with what you did and why, and the rationale that you have, because obviously you're able to say, I picked these people. I can't make generalizations, but I didn't want to anyway. I wanted to instead talk about this other. I was trying to describe the context or the group that was there. So they're all interrelated questions, but they're ones that I think that are worth spending some time thinking about. And you don't always have to have a quantitative survey. There's nothing inherently that says, oh my gosh, you must have quantitative. I hope I answered all of your questions. I was furiously writing them down. I don't know. Did I miss any?
Yeah. All good. Yeah, thanks so much. That was very helpful. Yeah.
Oh, and thank you, Melissa, for putting the link.
Thank you, Chris. While waiting for other comments or questions, I have another one, if you don't mind.
Sure.
We spoke about probability sampling.
Mm-hmm.
You spoke about 3 types or 3 approaches, one of which is the systematic approach. Could you please elaborate a bit on when and where that approach would be best?
Sure. So there's lots of different, there were the 3 different types. There's sort of that random, stratified, and systematic. If you're going to try to do, or if people are interested in trying to generalize to a big group. So if I want to say, and I'm going to use the American group this time. If I want to say that translators who belong to the American Translators Association approach or view or value this X, like in this sort of way, having a random sample is going to give you more statistical power from a quantitative perspective to be able to make generalizations. So if you have that randomization, either stratified or just straight randomization, that can be really useful. What's really hard about that is that we don't often have access to that kind of data. We don't have access to those logs of people. And so randomization, and that's true randomization, is really hard. That doesn't mean it's impossible, but it certainly means we have to be more, we have to be able to plug into that. So the next best thing that we can do really is being more intentional with our sampling that is not probabilistic. So if we're going to do convenience or snowball sampling, finding ways to sample broadly to get into multiple networks of people as opposed to just a small vein of folks, that can be really useful. I'd have to go back and look, and I probably could, I can find it relatively quickly when I'm, after the meeting if you'd like, but I only know of one study that was able to do stratified sampling where they were able to do it in a true probabilistic manner. And it's because they had access to that, an organizational type of list. So it doesn't happen all the time. And I think that that's one of the challenges that we have in the field, because we can't necessarily use some of the tools that are used in other places. Sometimes the way that it gets used, for instance, with some of the social science research folks in financial literacy, for instance, they actually have they have questions, 1 or 2 items that get added to the census. So they're able to collect across the whole population where I mean, if anybody manages to get a question on the census related to translation and interpreting, like, high five, because that's not going to happen that I'm aware of.
Thank you very much.
That answered your question. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Oh, I see a question in the chat, I think.
Yes. Yeah, part of my current, this is interpreted too, says, part of my current project, I'd like to know about the interpreting service users' attitudes and behaviors through questionnaires. I'm curious your opinions on using text entries in questionnaires for a qualitative analysis, and how many questions with text entries in a questionnaire you would recommend to be used.
So I think that's a nice question. I think having text open-ended questions or open-ended items is what you're talking about. Open-ended items are great. They can generate a lot of information. The challenge is, how do you get people to write enough so that it's actually, you get something meaningful? And so if you just say, what do you think? and you don't give them much of a prompt, you might get all kinds of stuff that's not useful for you. So first, I think it's really helpful to be able to ask a question or create an item that is going to elicit a response. So that's the first thing. The second is balancing how much time people are spending on it versus how much time they're going to spend answering becomes really important, because if you have 10 of them, it's going to feel like, well, do I really want to sit down and write all of these answers back to someone? And so there's trade-offs between how much time you spend asking those questions and can you get enough information. I think it's also important to remember that folks that are taking surveys will tend toward those extremes. And so somebody who's in the middle may not actually write very much because they think, oh, well, I've answered the other thing, the quantitative pieces, I don't have a lot to say. Whereas if somebody has an axe to grind, they might very well say, I'm going to tell you my story right now. And so you might get one answer that's this big, long thing, but it might not necessarily be indicative of everybody. So there's some trade-offs. I think so open-ended questions can be really useful, but I think we also have to approach them with a nuance that we recognize what it is that people are doing with those responses, why people are providing those types of answers, and that we have to then weigh that across all of the different responses to see whether or not it's truly indicative or not.
Chris, just a follow-up question from Sahan says, dear Professor Mellinger, thank you for your insightful presentation. In response to the last question about open-ended questions, can we use prompts?
Sure. I don't know what kind of prompt you have in mind, but you can certainly ask people to reflect on a situation if you wanted. You could ask people to, I think one of the challenges is writing good questions. And so I did a survey piece, but it was actually an interview. So it was not quantitative at all. And one of the things that we really worked at when we were doing these interviews was trying to find ways to get people to tell us about situations. We didn't want them to theorize for us. We didn't want to say, why do you do this? We were trying to avoid why. Because we wanted to be able to look at it from our theoretical perspective. And so this was a study that I did. It was with Pavel Korpal, and we did it on self-care. And so one of the questions was, tell us about a time when you where you use self-care, for instance. And that was an opportunity for them to tell us their story. they would write a bit more, and then we could take the results and then we could use the theory that we wanted to, the lens through which we wanted to analyze this. So yes, prompts I can think can be very helpful, and coming up with the ones that will generate the most information for you, I think can be really powerful.
Thank you, Chris. Annie has raised her hand. Annie, would you like
Sure.
to ask a question or make a comment? Annie, can you unmute?
I think it should
There we
be
go.
on.
Yeah, we can
thank
hear
you.
now.
Thank you, Christopher, for such a very informative lecture. I have a question in terms of presenting the data. I know you talk a lot about how to format it, how to plan it, and how to execute them, which I have done in my research as well. However, I have a bit of an issue with the data that you mentioned earlier, as in a non-response or like out of the bounds that you're actually asking them. How do you actually present them? Do you even consider it as a rubbish, or you don't even talk about it? Or is there something that could be done? I mean, some people say a non-responsive data is also a data as well. But again, I'm a newbie in terms of researching, so I'm not really sure whether I should talk about it or not even at all. Thank you.
So I think you asking the question is and you've already sort of answered some of your own question. So I think it's great. I think it's important to say, however, how much of a response you got. If you see all of a sudden that there's a drop in responses, to say halfway through the survey we had an attrition rate of whatever, so that is certainly appropriate. If you have an open-ended question, so like about the prompts that we were just talking about, and they say, you ask, tell us about a time that you were stressed interpreting. And they say, well, one time I was in my kitchen and I was making some food and my mom called me, and the next thing I knew, the fire department showed up. Well, that has nothing to do with the question that you just answered. And so if it was a one-off instance, maybe it's not worth saying anything about it. But if all of a sudden you get like 15 stories about the fire department showing up, maybe something's gone wrong. Like maybe maybe then it's worth reflecting and saying, the question didn't seem to really elicit the data that we originally anticipated. Here's the results that do speak to the question that we asked, but conclusions are tentative, because there seem to be some responses that don't align with what we were asking. So I think it's really a matter of just being transparent and being able to say, does it respond to the research question that you're asking? Does it talk about those sorts of issues? I do think sometimes outliers are fascinating. That's the other thing that I think that we should currently think about a little bit. I mean, if you have a story, if you're looking at qualitative data and you see almost everybody is doing one thing, you can say that this was really interesting and this is what most people said, but there was one person who was the opposite, and here's why and here's how. I think that can also be incredibly valuable. So I don't think it's really a case-by-case basis, but I think being upfront with what happened can be really informative. So I think you've already sort of started to answer your own question, which is great.
Thank you very much, Chris. I think it's getting dark at your end, so we'll probably let you go. Thank you very much for an informative presentation. I personally learned a lot, and I'm sure participants here agree, as I can see from some of the comments. Thanks to you once more, and see you soon.
Thank you all very much for the chance to speak with you, and it was good speaking.